All right, today we're going to a place that feels almost mythical, ancient Iraq, the land once known as Mesopotamia. This is the setting for some of the Bible's most famous cities, and really the place where civilization as we know it got its start. But here's a thought. What if the stories from the book of Genesis, the Garden of Eden, the Great Flood, what if they weren't just stories? What if they're actually echoes of real events, real people, and real places? Well, that's exactly what we're going to dig into. So let's get into it. You see, for decades, this entire region was pretty much off limits to archaeologists because of conflict. But that's changing. People are finally going back, and what they're finding is literally rewriting the very first chapter of our history. We've got a whole new generation of archaeologists, people like Sebastian Ray, who are out there exploring legendary sites like Gursu and Uruk, which you might know as the biblical city of Erech. And let me tell you, this is not your grandfather's archaeology. They are armed with some incredible new tech that is changing absolutely everything.
And this new toolkit is a total game changer. I mean, high-resolution drones can map an area in just a few hours that used to take months. They can see the faint ghosts of ancient canals buried under the desert, and with advanced radiocarbon dating, they can figure out how old these things are with incredible accuracy. We're making discoveries now at a pace that was just unthinkable a generation ago.
And all this new technology has led them straight into a massive puzzle. What was the real reason the world's first cities even came to be? Because it turns out the simple answer we've all believed for decades, well, it's completely wrong. For the longest time, the theory made perfect sense. To survive in the dry landscape of Mesopotamia, people had to build these huge canal systems for irrigation. A project that massive needs organization, it needs administration, and it needs a lot of people living together to build and maintain it. And boom, you get cities. It's a neat and tidy explanation, right? Well, here is where the whole story just gets turned on its head. Using that advanced radiocarbon dating on tiny ancient shells they found at the bottom of these canals, the archaeologists got a massive shock. These canals, these incredible engineering projects, weren't built when the cities were. They were built 1, even 2,000 years before the first brick was ever laid in the city of Uruk. This discovery just completely shatters the old theory. It means for thousands of years, people were living in this lush, irrigated landscape, a possible real-life Garden of Eden, without building any cities at all. So if it wasn't the need for organized farming, what was the real spark? What finally pushed humanity over the edge into building the metropolis? All the new evidence is pointing to a totally different answer. It flips the old theory on its head. The driving force wasn't the farm, it was the temple. The spark that created our first cities wasn't practical, it was spiritual. So, okay, how did that work? Well, archaeologists discovered that cities like Uruk and Girsu were built around these enormous sacred temple complexes, dedicated to gods like Inanna, the goddess of love, or Ningersu, the god of thunder. These temples were huge. You could see them for miles, and they acted like giant magnets, pulling in people who wanted to be closer to their gods. The temple wasn't just for worship. It became the city's entire economic engine. This whole shift created a brand new kind of world, a world that needed radical new inventions and created totally new forms of power. And out of this new urban explosion, we get the birth of writing, the rise of kings, and the origin of one of our oldest, most powerful myths. Okay, you have to think about this for a second. The single greatest invention in all of human history, writing, it wasn't created so we could write poems or epic stories. Nope, the Sumerian priests invented it for a much more down-to-earth reason, bureaucracy. They simply needed a way to keep track of all the stuff, the grain, the sheep, the fruit that was pouring into the temple as offerings. So writing started off as simple pictures of things, a drawing of a sheep. But that was way too slow for a busy temple. So the symbols got more and more abstract, and eventually they turned into this super efficient wedge-shaped script we now call cuneiform. All of a sudden, the priests could track everything, basically turning the temple into a massive ancient corporation. But this new city life, it had a dark side. It gave rise to a whole new kind of leader, the king, a guy who set himself up as the bridge between the people and the gods. And that power allowed them to build these incredible monuments. But ancient records show it was often done with what was pretty much forced labor. For the very first time in history, we see organized inequality, and soon after, organized warfare between rival cities. And it's from this incredibly complex, innovative, and often brutal new world that the first great piece of literature emerges, the Epic of Gilgamesh. And locked away inside this ancient poem is a story that absolutely stunned the world when it was rediscovered. A story about angry gods who decide to wipe out all of humanity with a great flood. Sound familiar? And this is where our whole investigation comes full circle. How on earth did these ancient Sumerian stories, written on clay tablets thousands of years earlier, find their way into the Hebrew Bible? I mean, just look at this. When you put the two stories side by side, the similarities are just uncanny. The reason for the flood, the hero who gets chosen, the task of building a boat, the outcome, the main story beats are almost identical. Finding Gilgamesh proved that the story of Noah wasn't a one-off. It was part of a much, much older tradition. So how did the story travel? Well, the answer lies in another legendary city, one that casts a huge shadow over the Old Testament, Babylon. The Babylonians rose to power long after the Sumerian cities had faded, but their leaders were smart. They knew they were building on the shoulders of giants. Okay, so here's how the story traveled. Babylon basically absorbed Sumerian culture. Their myths, their literature, all of it. Scribes in Babylonian schools actually learned how to write by copying old epics like Gilgamesh. Now, fast forward over 1,000 years to around 600 BCE. The Babylonians conquered Jerusalem, and they forced the Jewish elite into exile in Babylon. And it's there, scholars believe, that Hebrew scribes heard these ancient stories for the first time, and then wove them into their own sacred texts, retelling them through their own unique lens of one God. So in the end, the search for the real-life places behind Genesis has led us to something even bigger. It's led us to the genesis of pretty much everything we call civilization. Our first cities, the invention of writing, the idea of kingship and organized religion. It is, in a very real way, the story of how we were made. And that's why this work is just so important. It reminds us that our story is never really finished. Our understanding of the past is always changing. And it really makes you wonder, doesn't it? What other fundamental truths about who we are and where we come from are still buried out there, just waiting for the right moment to be brought back into the light?